I have sat on this bench for a very long time. I have seen every kind of liar, every kind of cheat, and every kind of fool walk through those heavy wooden doors. But there is a specific type of defendant that always catches my attention. It is the one who wears their privilege like a bulletproof vest, the one who walks into a courtroom not with fear, but with a smirk. The day Marcus Vance stepped into my courtroom, I knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, I knew exactly who he thought he was. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now, let me take you back to the morning this case truly began. Marcus was 24 years old, dressed in a custom-tailored dark suit that probably cost more than the plaintiff's vehicle. He carried himself with a terrifying kind of ease. Most people in my courtroom are nervous. Their hands shake. They look down. Their shoulders stay tight because deep down they understand the gravity of the law. Marcus did not seem to understand that. He strolled to the defendant's table, unbuttoned his jacket, and leaned back in his chair. He looked around the room as if he were inspecting a property he was about to purchase. Then, he looked directly at me. It was not a look of respect. It was not a look of fear. It was a look of mild amusement. Years on the bench teach you to recognize certain looks. He thought I was just a formality. He believed his family's wealth and his father's powerful name had already decided the verdict before I even picked up my gavel. Sitting directly behind him in the gallery was his father, Richard Vance. Richard was a prominent local businessman, a man used to making problems disappear with a simple phone call and a heavy checkbook. Marcus clearly expected this day to be no different. He expected his father's shadow to completely cover his sins. Across the aisle sat the plaintiff, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was 72 years old, a retired military veteran with a slight, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He wore a faded, meticulously ironed button-down shirt. He gripped the folder of evidence on the plaintiff's table with both hands, so tightly his knuckles were white. The contrast between the two tables was sickening. On one side, absolute vulnerability. On the other, arrogant entitlement. The complaint appeared straightforward on paper. Arthur claimed Marcus had recklessly destroyed his property, intentionally backing a luxury SUV into Arthur's vintage truck, and then verbally assaulting the old man when he dared to ask for insurance information. But as I looked down at the documents, and then back up at Marcus's unbothered, thin smile, I knew this case was about much more than a dented fender. This was about a boy who believed consequences were strictly for other people. But what Marcus did not realize was that a courtroom is the great equalizer. It does not care about your bank account, and it certainly does not care who your father is. And before the sun set that day, his blinding arrogance would lead him to commit the ultimate betrayal not just against the law, but against the very man sitting behind him. I asked Mr. Pendleton to state his case. When Arthur spoke, his voice was gravelly and quiet, forcing the entire room to lean in just to hear him. He explained that his 1978 Ford pickup was not just a vehicle. It was the last thing he and his late son had restored together before his son deployed and never came home. It was kept in immaculate condition, a rolling monument to a boy he had lost. Arthur testified that he was legally parked outside a local pharmacy, picking up his heart medication. Marcus was parked directly in front of him in a brand new, customized Range Rover. According to Arthur, Marcus came out of the store shouting into his phone, clearly agitated. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the luxury SUV into reverse, and stepped on the gas without a single glance in his rearview mirror. The impact was violent. It crushed the front grille of Arthur's vintage truck, shattered the headlights, and bent the heavy steel frame. But the physical damage was only the beginning of the assault. Arthur told the court that when he stepped out of his truck, his hands shaking from the sheer shock, he approached the Range Rover to politely exchange insurance information. Instead of an apology, Marcus rolled down his window and unleashed a barrage of insults. Arthur's voice cracked slightly as he recalled the exact words. He told me to get my piece of junk off the road. He said my whole truck wasn't worth the scratch on his rear bumper. And when I asked for his insurance, he just laughed at me. I watched Marcus carefully as Arthur spoke. In a normal courtroom, a defendant hearing this kind of testimony might look ashamed, defensive, or at least pretend to be sympathetic. Marcus did none of those things. He leaned over to his high-priced attorney, whispered something behind his hand, and actually chuckled. It was a small, quiet sound, but in a silent courtroom, a chuckle carries the weight of a scream. I saw the bailiff shift his weight. I saw Arthur close his eyes, swallowing the humiliation. And I saw Richard Vance, the powerful father sitting in the gallery, briefly tense his jaw. I turned my full attention to the defense table. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice cutting sharply through his amusement, "do you find something funny about an elderly man's property being destroyed?" Marcus stood up, buttoning his jacket with exaggerated slowness. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "it was a minor fender bender, an accident. He was parked entirely too close. Now he's up here giving a sob story because he sees a deep pocket and wants a free vehicle upgrade. He did not even try to deny the crash. He justified it. That is the absolute hallmark of unchecked privilege, believing that your destructive mistakes are someone else's fault simply because you are the one who made them." But Arthur had not come to my courtroom for a payday. He had come for accountability, and he had brought something Marcus never anticipated. Arthur's hands trembled as he opened his manila folder. He didn't shout or argue back when Marcus insulted him. He simply pulled out a stack of photographs and a small USB drive. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in his fingers, "I may be old, but I am not a liar, and my truck was not a piece of junk." He handed the evidence to my bailiff. When the photographs reached my desk, the reality of Marcus's minor fender bender became glaringly obvious. The front of Arthur's classic 1978 Ford was completely crushed. The grille was mangled, the hood crumpled, and the frame visibly bent. This was not a slow-speed tap in a parking lot. This was the result of a heavy vehicle accelerating backward in a blind rage. "Mr. Vance," I said, holding up a photograph of the devastation, "you consider this a minor scratch?" Marcus leaned on the defense table, barely glancing at the image. "My insurance company already offered him a settlement, Your Honor. My father's assistant handled it. $5,000. That's more than that rust bucket is worth. He refused it because he's greedy." In my courtroom, I watched the gallery just as closely as I watched the litigants. When Marcus mentioned his father's assistant handling the settlement, I looked past him to Richard Vance. The older man's posture shifted. His jaw tightened, and he uncrossed and recrossed his arms. That was a tell. Marcus was using his father's wealth as a shield, assuming the court would simply bow to the financial offer and dismiss the behavior. Arthur spoke up, his tone hardening. "I refused the money because your father's assistant told me if I didn't take it, you people would tie me up in court until I was dead. They said you were untouchable." The courtroom went dead silent. Marcus's high-priced attorney, a man named Sterling, immediately shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. My client cannot be held responsible for the alleged statements of a third-party assistant." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," I commanded. I looked back at Marcus. The smirk was still there, but it was tighter now. He was enjoying this. He loved the power dynamic of crushing a vulnerable man. "I didn't need my dad's assistant to tell him that," Marcus sneered, entirely ignoring his lawyer's desperate attempt to protect him. "I told him myself. I told him he picked the wrong family to mess with. That was the first crack in the armor. Arrogant people cannot help themselves. They are so desperate to appear powerful that they will freely admit to intimidation just to prove they can get away with it." But Marcus had no idea what Arthur had waiting on that USB drive. Rachel Morgan, Arthur's attorney, stood up. She was a woman who never raised her voice because she never needed to. "Your Honor," she said, addressing the court while looking directly at Marcus, "we would like to introduce Plaintiff's Exhibit A." The USB drive contains security footage from the pharmacy's exterior cameras, which were pointed directly at the parking lot. Marcus's smirk vanished instantly. He sat up straight. His attorney, Sterling, looked down at his notes, his face draining of color. Sterling had probably begged Marcus to tell him the truth, to warn him of any footage, and Marcus had likely sworn there was none. In my courtroom, the most dangerous lies are the ones clients tell their own lawyers. I allowed the footage to be played. The screens in the courtroom flickered to life. The video was clear, high definition, and unmistakable. It showed Arthur Pendleton walking slowly out of the pharmacy, holding a small paper bag. It showed Marcus Vance storming out behind him, yelling into a cell phone, his face twisted in anger. The footage captured Marcus throwing himself into the Range Rover. It showed him slamming the car into reverse. And then, it showed the violent, completely unbraked impact as the heavy SUV crushed the front of Arthur's truck. But the most damning part of the video was what happened next. The camera had audio. As Arthur approached the Range Rover, the court heard the unmistakable, entitled voice of Marcus Vance. "Get your piece of junk out of my way, old man. You're lucky I don't sue you for scratching my bumper." Arthur's voice, shaky but polite, asked for insurance. Marcus laughed. "Insurance? My dad is Richard Vance. You think you're getting a dime? Move your garbage truck before I call the cops and say you backed into me." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I turned to look at the gallery. Richard Vance, the powerful, untouchable father, was staring at the screen. His face was rigid, his eyes locked on the image of his son humiliating a veteran. I looked back at Marcus. He was no longer leaning back. He was no longer smirking. He was staring at the table, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had walked into my courtroom believing his name was a shield, but the video had just turned that shield into a cage. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice echoing in the still room, "would you care to revise your definition of a minor fender bender?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. His attorney leaned over, whispering frantically, trying to salvage a defense that had just been vaporized. But what happened next was something I had never seen in all my years on the bench. The true twist of this case was not the video, it was the man sitting in the gallery, the man whose name Marcus had just used as a weapon. For a full 10 seconds after the video ended, no one spoke. In a courtroom, 10 seconds of silence feels like an absolute eternity. It is the heavy, suffocating sound of a lie dying in broad daylight. Marcus Vance, the young man who had strolled into my courtroom just an hour earlier, acting as if he owned the building, was now physically shrinking in his chair. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice low but carrying sharply across the room, "you sat in this courtroom under oath and testified that this was a minor accident. You claimed the plaintiff was exaggerating for a financial payout, yet the court just watched you intentionally ram a 2-ton luxury vehicle into an elderly man's prized possession in a fit of pure rage. And then, instead of taking responsibility, you threatened him." Marcus swallowed hard. You could see the panic rising in his chest. His eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for an exit, looking for an excuse, and finally, looking at his attorney. Mr. Sterling slowly stood up, but his posture was completely different now. He was no longer the confident, high-priced defense attorney ready to bully a vulnerable plaintiff. He was a man desperately trying to save his own professional reputation from the fallout of his client's perjury. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, wiping a hand across his forehead. My client was under immense emotional distress that day. He overreacted, yes, but the footage doesn't fully capture his state of mind." "The footage speaks for itself, Mr. Sterling," I interrupted, striking my gavel once to cut him off. "Do not insult my intelligence, and do not compromise your own legal license by attempting to defend a blatant, documented lie." Sterling sat down immediately. He did not say another word. He simply pushed his chair slightly away from Marcus. It was a subtle, physical movement, but in the language of the courtroom, it spoke volumes. The lawyer was abandoning ship. He knew the case was dead. With his legal shield gone, Marcus did what entitled, spoiled children always do when they are finally cornered by reality. He looked backward. He turned around in his heavy wooden chair to look at the gallery, seeking the one man who had always bailed him out of trouble, the man whose powerful name he had so casually weaponized against Arthur Pendleton. He looked at his father. I shifted my gaze to Richard Vance. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what the wealthy businessman would do next. Would he stand up and cause a scene? Would he demand an immediate recess so his team of lawyers could write a bigger check to silence the old man? Marcus locked eyes with his father, his face pale and pleading. "Dad," he whispered. His voice cracked, stripping away the tough guy facade and revealing exactly what he was, a terrified little boy instead of a grown man facing the consequences of his own actions. But Richard Vance did not move to comfort his son. He did not reach for his checkbook. He did not call out to the attorney. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his cane, staring back at Marcus with a look of absolute, icy disgust. That look was heavier than my gavel. It was the moment Marcus realized his armor was gone. Richard Vance did not break eye contact with his son for a long, agonizing moment. In my courtroom, I have seen parents lie, cheat, and bankrupt themselves to protect their children from the consequences of their own actions. It is a primal instinct, but it is often a highly destructive one. Marcus was banking on that instinct. He firmly believed the Vance name was more important to his father than the truth. But Richard slowly stood up. He did not look at the panicked defense attorney. He did not look at Arthur Pendleton. He looked directly at me. Your Honor? Richard's voice was deep, steady, and completely devoid of the toxic arrogance his son possessed. May I address the court? Normally, a spectator is not permitted to speak during a hearing. But this was not a normal hearing, and Richard was not a normal spectator. He was the very weapon his son had used to intimidate the plaintiff. I nodded. You may, Mr. Vance. Proceed. Marcus watched his father with wide, desperate eyes. Dad, please. Be quiet, Marcus, Richard snapped. He didn't shout, but the absolute authority in his tone made the young man flinch as if he had been physically struck. The tension in the room grew suffocating. Richard turned back to the bench. Your Honor, he began, his hands tightly gripping the wooden railings separating the gallery from the well. I have spent my entire life building a reputation based on hard work and accountability. I provided my son with every advantage. I gave him the best education, the finest vehicles, and the benefit of the doubt. But I will not give him a free pass to destroy an innocent man's property and weaponize my name to avoid the consequences. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. Marcus slumped in his chair, the very last drops of color draining from his face. His untouchable armor was not just cracked, it had been completely shattered from the inside out by the one person he thought would save him. The settlement offer my assistant made was based on a deliberate lie, Richard continued, his voice thick with a mixture of public shame and unyielding fatherly resolve. Marcus told me he barely scratched an illegally parked truck. Had I known the truth, had I known he viciously threatened a veteran and destroyed his prized vehicle in a tantrum, I would have dragged him into this courtroom by his collar myself. Power is a privilege, Your Honor. It is never an excuse. The silence that followed Richard Vance's statement was so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. A father had just publicly dismantled his own son's entire defense, choosing integrity over blood. I looked at Marcus. He was completely broken. The false confidence, the smirk, the tailored suit that was supposed to act as his armor, none of it mattered anymore. He had believed that his father's name was a magic wand that could wave away his responsibilities. He had been so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own invincibility, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that his father might possess a moral compass. Thank you, Mr. Vance, I said, breaking the silence. My voice carried a weight of respect that I rarely offered in this courtroom. Your integrity is noted and appreciated. I turned my attention back to the defense table. Marcus was staring at his hands, unable to meet my eyes, unable to meet his attorney's eyes, and most certainly unable to look back at his father. Marcus Vance, I began, my tone shifting back to the sharp authority of the bench. You walked into this courtroom today believing you were untouchable. You believed that because you drive a luxury vehicle and carry a certain last name, the rules of basic human decency and the laws of this state do not apply to you. I picked up the photographs of Arthur's crushed truck and held them up. You intentionally destroyed a man's property in a fit of temper. When confronted, you did not apologize. You escalated. You belittled him. You threatened him with your family's resources. And then you came into my courtroom and lied under oath, claiming he was the greedy one. I paused, letting the reality of his situation fully settle over him. Your father is correct. Power and privilege are not shields to hide behind when you behave terribly. They are responsibilities. And today, you have proven yourself completely incapable of handling either. I did not just award Arthur Pendleton the full cost of the repairs to his vintage truck. I awarded him maximum damages for the emotional distress caused by Marcus's intimidation. I imposed severe sanctions against Marcus for perjury and filing a frivolous defense. Furthermore, I stated, leaning forward, I am ordering you to perform 500 hours of community service. Not at a desk, Mr. Vance. You will be assigned to the local Veterans Assistance Center, where you will spend your weekends serving the very people you felt so comfortable disrespecting. I struck my gavel. The sound was sharp and final. The case was closed, but the real punishment for Marcus was just beginning. When the gavel struck the sounding block, the sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a heavy period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. The hearing was officially over, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Sterling, the high-priced defense attorney, did not offer his client a single comforting word. He simply snapped his leather briefcase shut, gave me a curt, professional nod, and walked briskly out through the swinging wooden doors. He was a man who billed by the hour, and he knew better than to stand next to a sinking ship when the water was already over the deck. Marcus was left sitting completely alone at the defense table. He looked over his shoulder one last time, his eyes wide and panicked, perhaps hoping for a final sliver of paternal mercy. But Richard Vance was already walking down the center aisle. He didn't look back at his son. Instead, the wealthy businessman stopped directly beside the plaintiff's table. He looked down at Arthur Pendleton, the elderly veteran whose hands had finally, completely stopped trembling. "Mr. Pendleton," Richard said, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable burden of a father's shame, "I cannot undo the profound disrespect my son showed you today, nor can I magically repair the sentimental value of your vehicle. But I give you my word as a man, his debt to you will be paid in full, and he will earn every single penny of it with his own two hands." Arthur looked up, his faded eyes meeting Richard's. He didn't gloat. He didn't ask for more. He simply offered a slow, respectful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. Accountability is all I ever asked for." That brief exchange was the most powerful moment of the entire trial. It was the exact moment Marcus realized that true respect cannot be bought, inherited, or bullied into existence. It has to be earned through character. Arthur gathered his manila folder and left the courtroom with his head held high, his dignity entirely restored. Marcus was left to be escorted by the bailiff to sign his community service mandates, a remarkably small-looking young man who had just been forcefully introduced to the real world. I have thought about this case many times since that afternoon. People often walk into my courtroom confusing wealth with actual power. They wear their privilege like a crown, assuming the justice system will simply bow to their last name. But a courtroom is the ultimate equalizer. It strips away the custom suits, the heavy bank accounts, and the corporate titles, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. Marcus Vance believed his father's name would save him. In the end, it was his father's character that destroyed his illusion of invincibility. Thank you for watching this story. If you believe that accountability should apply to everyone, regardless of their wealth or status, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let us know your thoughts on the father's decision in the comments below, and I will see you in the next case.